Thank you. Thank you, Richard. It's funny. Sort of similar things were happening with me, and people kept saying, you need to look at the Barrett framework. You need to, about 4 or 5 people told me, and I finally looked at it. I said, wow, there's the missing link for us. How do you start to tangibilize some of these things? So again, thank you so much, Richard, one of my favorite people on this planet, and it's really been a pleasure to get to know him. Thank you also to Phil and Ashley and the other Barrett people, and also to NetBank for enabling me to come here and spend some time with this group. The subtitle for my talk is Actualizing Business and Human Potential. I really think business as an institution has the ability to allow us all to truly achieve our potential, more so than other institutions in society which have also worked to that end, whether it's governments or religious institutions or a variety of nonprofits. All of them are doing wonderful work, but ultimately it's going to be business that either enables us to move forward and make progress or takes us in the other direction, which is equally possible, depending on how we approach it. So I like to start with this simple metaphor. We've all seen this. Remember when we were children and we first saw the caterpillar? And we saw the caterpillar eating its way systematically through anything in its path. And then we saw a butterfly, and somebody said, that's the same creature, that this thing actually turns into that. So how is that possible, right? That's like magic. It's one of nature's many little miracles. But in the case of the caterpillar, once it has achieved a certain weight, etc., then a switch gets turned on by nature. The imaginal cells, as they're called, get activated, and it goes into that cocoon phase, the metamorphosis, and then emerges a certain amount of time later as this other creature, which is quite different. Same DNA, but a very different creature. So what is the caterpillar's higher purpose while it exists as a caterpillar? All it does is consume. It's a great consumer, right? Consumer confidence is very high, as they call it in the US. But then the butterfly emerges, and the butterfly really is about more than that. It's a creature of light and beauty, but it is also something that creates value in the system, in nature, through pollination, right? It enables other things to flower and give fruit. And that kind of a transformation, which happens automatically in the case of the butterfly, is something that we're all capable of as human beings. And we're all on this journey. Every one of us in this room is on that journey somewhere. We're all kind of born in a caterpillar-like state. Really can't do much other than consume. But over time, some of us are able to move beyond that. Some actually, unfortunately, get stuck. We spend our whole life essentially consuming and accumulating and say, here's my stuff, and this is my clutter, and my clutter is better than your clutter, and I've got more of it, and then I die, right? And some of us move past the clutter and say, well, at some point you say, well, that's not what it's all about. There's something more to this journey. And we are able to elevate ourselves really without limit. Peter Kastenbaum said that we have reached such explosive levels of freedom that we are now in charge of our own mutation. In other words, we have to will it. We have to have that intention for us to be able to rise. And the degree to which we're able to transform is actually probably way beyond what even the caterpillar and the butterfly represent. Human beings are capable of rising to extraordinary heights, as we have seen throughout our history, or we're also capable of being perfectly stuck or even going the other direction. The same is true of these entities that we have created in our image, the corporation. The modern corporation is really, in the eyes of the law, regarded as a virtual person. And that person, too, can exist at a caterpillar level, which is all about self-interest. And it's about thinking of accumulating and delivering and creating as many profits for yourself as possible. And everything else is incidental to that end. Or it can rise to be this creature of light and beauty and tremendous value creation in the world. And that's what the best corporations are about. We just heard from Emmanuel what he's doing in his business. I mean, that's a beautiful thing. When you have a business that is creating value, and in the process of creating value for everyone, they, of course, themselves generate value for themselves as well. So that's really what this journey towards conscious capitalism is about. It's about achieving that potential that is inherent within us as human beings as well as in corporations. Before I talk about conscious capitalism, however, I do like to spend a few minutes just talking about capitalism. Because this is a system that is, I think, widely misunderstood, and especially right now is being deeply questioned. And a lot of people are saying, well, is this is sort of an inhumane, based on selfishness and greed and all of those kinds of things, and it's plundering the earth and it's shortening our lives and doing all kinds of things. I think there's some misunderstanding of what this system really is. It really is simply about free markets and free people, people being allowed to engage in voluntary exchange with each other. There's something inherent to us as a species. We're the only species that actually trades and exchanges value. Every other species sort of exists and does certain things for itself. But we have this extraordinary ability to elevate each other through the process of exchange. And when we're allowed to do that, we've seen it throughout human history that we have progressed. We have done well. Our life expanse or expectancy has increased. We have flourished. We have achieved more and have greater life satisfaction. So what has capitalism given us in a very short amount of time, just in the last couple of centuries really? Extraordinary innovations, technologies, breakthroughs that have transformed our lives. But more than that, it's really not about the gadgets and the technologies. It's really about what it has done for the average or common person out there. So if you look at the vast expanse of human history, going back even tens of thousands of years, you see that the normal condition of the average person on this planet was one of abject misery and poverty. It's really true for the most part. That per capita incomes have not exceeded $400 or $500 throughout recorded human history until as recently as the year 1800. 90% or more of people on this planet lived on less than $1 a day in today's terms, which we define as sort of the lowest level of abject poverty. And that was the normal condition. And that has started to change dramatically, and the change really started to happen. If you look at this chart, which just goes back over the last 2 millennia, the year 0 we were at $473, and the year 1000 we went down to $453. We actually lost almost an entire millennium in terms of making progress for the average person. Right? So we had a few people in society that were living relatively well, although I'm sure none of you would exchange your life with any of those. Okay, back then, but the vast majority of people were living lives that averaged about 30 years in length. There were only a few 100 million of us on this planet, and the population would fluctuate up and down by 30, 40, 50%, depending on plagues and other things. We did not have the ability to feed ourselves. It's only around 1750 and then into the 19th century that things started to change with the Industrial Revolution, but also then with the invention of this idea of the market and capitalism, first articulated fully by Adam Smith, as you know, in his book, The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. So this sort of laid the groundwork for why markets work the way they do. And the same year, of course, we had the Declaration of Independence in the US. So we had, in a way, the coming together of free markets and free people, and that combination found its fullest expression in that society, more so than any other. And then you saw the extraordinary changes that occurred as a result of that, not only in the US, but in industrialized countries, and then going beyond that in recent decades. And you saw the dramatic shift that happened. So if you look at this curve, it's an exponential rise, not only in per capita income in real terms, but also in human population and human life expectancy. So we've gone from 30 to 65, we've gone from 1 billion in 1820 to 7 billion, and we've gone from about $500 or $600 to now close to about $8,000 or $9,000, again in real terms on a global basis. And that matters. It means that the average person today lives a life that is not just about subsistence, that it is something where they can actually aspire to more, they can actually realize more of what it means to be a human being, because some of those needs are being taken care of. So the economic success of capitalism is without question absolutely unprecedented in human history. What has happened in the last 2 centuries, which is a very short amount of time relative to how long we've been here on this planet. But you can see some of these numbers in terms of real increases in per capita income. Of course, Africa has lagged behind, but even here there is a positive story, and actually now you're starting to see a lot of excitement about what's potentially possible and is already starting to happen here. If you look in the United States, the estimates are that the average person today is about 100 times better off than they were 2 centuries ago, if you adjust for quality and affordability of what you get for the same amount of money that you have to spend. If you look at a country like South Korea, which embraced free markets around 1950, and North Korea, when they separated, the GDP of North Korea, I believe, was a little bit higher per capita and the total GDP. South Korea's GDP has expanded 250 times in that span, in just 50 years. And of course, we know what has happened in North Korea. So this really is a powerful thing. And it affects, as I said, people at the so-called base of the pyramid, the ordinary person, more so than the fact that it has created wealth at the top, which it has done. But overall, the bigger story is that today we're down to about 14 or 15% of people living on less than $1 a day, and that's down from 85% in 1820. And if these trends continue, if we allow the spread of free markets and free people and all the institutions and the rule of law and everything else that goes with that, there's every possibility that in this century we could eradicate abject poverty. We really can. Muhammad Yunus, who started the Grameen Bank, he likes to say someday poverty is something, abject poverty is something that we should have to go to a museum to see. This is what it was like, right? And we can get there, if we simply allow and enable and strengthen this system to continue. So I start with these premises that, first of all, the institution of business is fundamentally good because it is based on the creation of value. No business survives and grows unless it is actually creating value, not just for customers, but also for the people who work there and the communities that is in. Ultimately, in the long term, if you don't create value, you don't exist. So business by definition is good because it creates value. It is ethical because it is based on voluntary exchange. Businesses do not have coercive power, again, in free markets. I'm not talking about monopoly situations or where there are companies that are in bed with the government and they're creating conditions where, that's crony capitalism, or what we also call crapitalism. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about true free markets and free people. It's ethical because, unlike the government, businesses do not have coercive power. Right? You have the opportunity or the option of dealing with them or not. That business is noble because it can elevate our existence. It can allow us, as I said, to rise above subsistence and therefore achieve more than simply living hand to mouth and keeping body and soul together. That's what most people have done throughout history, but today the average person can actually aspire to more. And finally, I believe it's heroic because more than any other institution, business has lifted people out of poverty. We have this narrative about business that it's about selfishness and greed and exploitation and all the rest of it. And those of us who then get connected to the world of business via working in a company, etc., suddenly that becomes our story. We say, well, this is what business is all about, and I'm part of that system now, so I must be greedy and exploitative. And it sort of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But when you change the narrative to say, here's an institution that has lifted people out of poverty more than the church and more than the government and more than voluntary non-profits, then you say, wow, there's something noble and beautiful about that. And that is alone sustainable out of all of those other ways of addressing that, because the technology of those other things is taxation and charity. Here it is self-sustaining. Businesses do that in a self-sustaining way. They enable that virtuous circle to rise and enable people to come out of those conditions. Again, if it is done in the right way and if those conditions prevail. Now, despite all of that, the fact is that we are living at a time today when the overall perception about business is extremely negative, and probably nowhere more so than in the United States, which to me is ironic because this is the home of global capitalism. I think it was Herbert Hoover who said the business of America is business. And yet here's a country where the average person has a tremendously jaundiced view about business, especially about big business, large corporations. So you can see some of the data that is cited over here. I won't go into all of that. I'm going to come back to that Gallup study in a few minutes, but the numbers are quite startlingly bad, despite, as I said, all of the evidence to the contrary over the last couple of centuries. And there are good reasons for that. People are not stupid, right? There's reasons why they're feeling upset and cynical about all of this. Because we keep going through these periodic cycles, right? Boom and bust. We have all these bailouts that happen with regular frequency in the US. I've been there 25 years. Every 5 or 10 years, there's a bailout of the financial industry. Something that happens. Trillions of dollars get sunk into that. So as Tom Friedman put it, that this growth model that we've created does not seem to be sustainable in economic or ecological terms anymore. We have to think differently about how to do it. That Mother Nature and Father Greed have hit the wall at the same time. I knew about Mother Nature, I didn't know about Father Greed, right? This is not a happy marriage here, Mother Nature and Father Greed. But there's something happening there that this system that is predicated on some narrow views of what business is about, it's about profit maximization and shareholder value and all of that, and that has somehow enshrined the idea of greed and selfishness as virtues. Well, that's not true. Greed and selfishness can never be virtues. Self-interest is okay, selfishness is not. And we have to change the narrative about business away from that that notion and bring it back to what it really is. In a sense, we need a new ethical foundation for the practice of business. But let's look at some of what has happened as a consequence of the way that we have created the kind of prosperity that we have in the last century. There have been some unintended consequences of that. There have been some so-called side effects, or what we also call collateral damage, if you will. Right? And we've sort of accepted that. Well, 75% of the forest cover on this planet is gone in the last 100 years. 30% of the arable land that can produce food. 90% of the large mammals, the elephants, the lions, and the tigers, 90% gone in just the last century. 95% of the large fish, the oceans are emptying out of the large fish and many of the other species as well. Half the species that are here today may be gone in 50 years. And perhaps most alarmingly, the toxic burdens on our bodies is starting to now show up in a dramatic way. We've sort of had this century-long experiment with what I call chemically assisted living. Almost everything that we consume and eat and wear and experience in our lives is, has been processed with all kinds of things in it, artificial things, and individually each of them is perhaps deemed to be at a safe level, but you put it all together over time and you start to see statistics like the President's Commission on Cancer in the US just came out a couple of years ago and said 41% of Americans alive today can expect to get cancer in their lifetimes, 50% of men and 33% of women. I mean, I've had 2 friends in the last 4 weeks getting diagnosed with cancer, my age. Right? I mean, it's startling, really. The same commission under the Reagan administration just 25 years ago had estimated about a 22% incidence of cancer. So in one generation, we've gone from 22 to 41%. This is a disease that 100 years ago was rare. Very, very few people got it, even if they lived to a long age. So there's something that's happening there. A third of children born after the year 2000 expected to get diabetes. Right? And we have many other chronic things that are growing actually right now. Of course, we have a real crunch when it comes to natural resources, petroleum being one of them, but also potash and many of the other things that are now, because demand is exploding just as we're starting to run into the limits of supply, and finding more oil and more of these resources becoming expensive and complex and dangerous increasingly in the future. So we're going to have to start to see, again, the petroleum-based economy that we have is only 100 years old. So in the expanse of human history, this is a very brief chapter and it's about to end. Not that long, maybe in our lifetimes for those of us in this room. So we're going to have to do things differently. Just as we have in many countries, especially the US, we have a trade deficit and we have a budget deficit, we also have a nature deficit. We started to run a deficit around the year 1980 that we're using more of nature's resources than nature can replenish. And I'm talking about the renewable resources. The non-renewable resources like petroleum, etc., forget about that. That takes millions of years. So that's not going to happen. But even the things like the trees and the fish and all of that, we're actually pulling out more than nature can replenish. And you've probably seen these kinds of estimates that if everybody on this planet aspired to live the way Americans do today, what we consume, energy, water, food, etc., that we would need 5 planets, and if we live like Europeans, it's a little better, but not a lot. We still only have the one, so we have to figure out how to do things differently. So the fact is, even though we've achieved a lot of prosperity, in order to continue to deliver that to the people who have it, and more importantly, to bring it to still the billions who really don't have it, we are going to have to do things differently. And where is that going to come from? Those innovations, those technologies, those breakthroughs, it's going to have to come from the world of business. And is business going to be able to deliver that? Well, not if this trend continues. So I talked about the amount of confidence that people have in big business. You can see it was never that great even in the 1970s, but at least a third of the population had confidence in large companies. Now it's down to somewhere in the teens. In fact, in 2009 it was at 16%, which was below the US Congress. Those of you who live in the US know that the US Congress always occupies the bottom spot in any survey of confidence or faith in institutions. Right? But big business fell below that. And if you look at where that trend is going, it's not a good direction. So the fact is, where are these innovations and breakthroughs going to come from? Some small companies may do that, but ultimately this is where the power is. This is where the resources are. This is where the impact is. Do you know that Walmart today has $470 billion in revenue, which is about equal to the GDP of the entire planet in the year 1800. We had 1 billion people making about $500 per person in the year 1800. So global GDP was about $500 billion. Today, one large corporation has annual revenues that are approaching that. So this is where the resources and the power and the impact right? The footprint on the planet is enormous of the large corporation, and yet it is viewed, as I said, very negatively and cynically, and that matters to all of us. As I said, that's where the innovations, the breakthroughs that we need are going to have to come from. And the fact is, when people are cynical and distrustful, they are incapable of creating. Right? If you go to work and you don't trust your company, you don't trust the leaders of it, you don't respect the people you work with, you have no autonomy and freedom, can you actually be innovative and creative? You really can't. So we haven't created the conditions in which human beings can operate in that way. Plus, we erode what we call social capital. There's a lack of trust. There's tremendous amount of defensive behavior. There's huge legal costs, etc. And not a lot of things, positive things, can happen in that situation. So the question is, why has this happened? Especially in our recent history, why in the last few decades, especially, have we seen a growing divergence between big business and society as a whole? By the way, in that same survey, small business is at 65%, where big business is at 18 or 19. And the most trusted institution in the US is the military. 85% of Americans trust the US military, and only 18, 19% trust big business. Think about that, where people are coming from, right? I think it's a sad commentary on where we are right now. So why has this happened? Why is it that a small company becomes large? Because every big business was once a small business. Why do they have to lose the public trust? What happens when a company goes public? How come it starts to diverge from the interests of society? Ultimately, businesses have to be aligned with what is good for society. Now, we believe the answer really is a couple of things. First of all, the world has changed dramatically around us. It's actually startling how many things have happened just in the last 20 years, as I'll talk about. And secondly, we as human beings are evolving at a very rapid rate. So we've all seen that chart where we get up on our two legs, so the evolutionary chart. Is that the end of the story? No, it's not, by any means, right? So evolution has actually continued. In fact, it has accelerated, probably by 100-fold in terms of the speed of evolution that's happening here, but it has gone inward. So things that are changing are now within us in terms of our capacities and our values and our way of thinking about life. And again, businesses really haven't adapted to all of these new realities. And that's what needs to happen here. So how are we changing? Well, I mentioned 1776 as a significant year, but also 1989 in more recent history, I think will go down as almost equally significant. Because what happened in 1989? This really marked a turning point in our evolution and our history. What is the big headline story of 89? Anybody remember? The Berlin Wall, right? The collapse of the Berlin Wall, which happened in November, preceded by, on June 1st of that year, Tiananmen Square. Anybody remember Tiananmen Square? Anybody remember how you felt when you saw that scene? I had goosebumps. In fact, I remember the day for two reasons. One is my wife was in labor, giving birth to our first child. So we were in the hospital. After 15 hours of labor, I was more focused on the TV. I said, yes, please keep breathing, but, and my attention was focused on this little TV they had over there. And she said, what are you doing? We're having a baby here. I said, I know, but there's a billion people over there trying to break free, okay? This is extraordinary. I never thought I would live to see that day, right? This was Red China, And this kid who stood in front of the tanks and all, it was deeply inspiring stuff. Of course, that got suppressed and all of that. But it probably planted the seeds for what happened a few months later in Germany and then throughout Eastern Europe. Before we knew it, the defining debate of the 20th century was behind us. This had defined our existence. Remember those of us who grew up in that Cold War era and we had these nuclear alerts and we had to get under the desk and we had all these kinds of things, Cold War. The world was divided into these two camps. And a few countries in between, like India and Egypt and others, who were part of the non-aligned movement, so to speak, right? But you really had a black and white world, and you were with us or you were against us. You were either for free markets and free people or completely centrally controlled and lack of economic freedom and political freedom. And now suddenly that was gone, and the realization was that there is one good way to organize human beings, which is with freedom. Economic and political freedom, but now we could talk in terms of shades of gray. What kind of political freedom, what kind of economic freedom, what are the constraints on that, etc. Before that, there was no room for that nuance. This was also the year we had the Exxon Valdez oil spill up in Alaska, if you remember. Now, the interesting thing about that was that this environmental consciousness had sort of lay dormant for a while. It had been triggered by Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, in the 1960s, which had sounded some alarms about what was happening out there. But it really didn't break through into the mass consciousness. But this particular event, it was on TV every day, and people saw this, and people were really moved by it. And it actually led to changes, not only in their consciousness, but also in the law and also in corporate behavior. Exxon actually has an exemplary safety record from that point forward. They have put into place tremendous numbers of changes. But this, in a way, marked the birth of the environmental consciousness movement on a mass scale. It was also the year, ironically, on Valentine's Day of that year, February 14, the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran issued the fatwa against Salman Rushdie for having published the satanic verses, which was seen as an anti-Islam, etc. And most people who were fighting and dying over it, of course, had not even read the book. But this was, in a way, the emergence or re-emergence of religious fundamentalism as a force on the planet after a long time where it had been dormant. We had many wars in the past, of course, as you know, right? The Crusades and many others that were fought over religious reasons, but that had not been a big factor. But now suddenly, almost like it was stepping into the vacuum created by the end of economic fundamentalism on the one hand, we had this religious fundamentalism that suddenly emerged, and it has been with us as a force, as you know, right? And the 9/11 and all the other things that have happened subsequently. Those were some of the headline events, but there were also other things that were happening below the surface in the same year. 1989 marked a significant demographic turning point in the United States, which was that for the first time we had more adults over the age of 40 than below. Now, this had already happened in Europe, and it had happened in Japan way before. So the median age of adults now in the US is 44. It's about 48 to 50 in the European countries, and it's well into the 50s in Japan. Now, what does that mean? It means that society as a whole is aging rapidly. And that's generally true almost around the world. There are very few societies that are actually getting younger. Many are further along than others are, but everybody's moving in that direction because birth rates are falling just about everywhere, and life expectancies are increasing just about everywhere. So the median age keeps shifting upwards. Now, what does that imply for society? We have a construct in the book called the psychological center of gravity, which is the median age of adults plus minus 5 years. It says that's where the sweet spot is for society, that the values of a society will be determined by the values of that cohort. And if you look at what happens to people as they reach midlife, there is a subtle shift that happens. The field of developmental psychology talks a lot about this, right? So whereas in our early chapters in our life leading up to 40, we are much more concerned about building our career, accumulating possessions, accumulating position in society, etc., right? The bigger house, the bigger car, all of that kind of stuff. And suddenly around midlife, people start to question all of those things. First of all, they say, is this all life is about? I've lived half of it now, and it's not satisfying me the same way. Is this all it's about? The questions around meaning and purpose and around legacy and broader impact and what kind of world are we leaving behind for our children and grandchildren, and I'm doing okay, but what about the rest of the people on this planet who are suffering? All of that starts to feel much more real, and people are much more driven by those kinds of questions than ever before. And what happens with the psychological center of gravity being where it is, it actually impacts the culture as a whole. The zeitgeist, as we call it, gets transformed. So even young people growing up in that environment start to get infected by it. In other words, they start to think about meaning and purpose at a much earlier age. So we talk about the millennial generation, where data shows that it's the most meaning and purpose-driven generation that we've ever had. And they've gotten it at a very early age. So society as a whole is now driven by, in most countries, a different set of values than used to exist before. The other thing that happened that year, in 1989, was triggered by this person. He invented something that changed the world more than I think almost anything else that any other person has invented in the last couple of centuries. So in that sense, he's had a bigger impact on the planet than any other individual. And yet he is almost completely anonymous. He could be sitting in any room in any hotel in the world in the back somewhere, and nobody would know. Who is this guy? Tim Berners-Lee, right? How many of you knew that? Very few people. I mean, most audiences, this guy is anonymous essentially. Now, who is he? How would you look like to put that on your resume? Invented the World Wide Web, right? He's now a professor at MIT. He actually lives in the same town that I live. His daughter was in my daughter's class, and I went to a back-to-school night, and it said Nancy Berners-Lee. I said, oh my God, is that? I mean, to me, this guy's like a demigod, right? I mean, he's done something extraordinary. British citizen working in the Swiss laboratory CERN came up with www and HTTP and .com and URL and All that stuff came out of his head, right? And now it's an inseparable part of our life. It has transformed the planet. I don't think this is an exaggeration to say this, that this has transformed the planet more than any other single invention. In a very short amount of time, literally within a few years, this was a mass market phenomenon, right? And we went from thousands to millions to hundreds of millions to billions of people being impacted by this. What has it done? It has ushered in an era of information egalitarianism, or democracy, if you will. The average person, remember we used to say knowledge is power, and very few people in the world had it. Owning a book used to be a luxury not that long ago. You go back to the 16 and 17 and 1800s and see how much of your income, what percentage of your income, you would be spending 80% of your income buying those three books a week, in those days. Right? It was a real luxury. And now we have the average person in the world has access to more information instantaneously at their fingertips, anytime, any place for free, than the richest billionaire in the world did in 1989. True? Right? And not only can I find out what happened 5,000 years ago in Egypt, I can find out what happened 5 minutes ago in Tunisia. It's all there. It's this cloud floating around. There's no question I can ask of any audience anywhere in the world I can't get an answer back within seconds.